Welcome, everybody, to episode 37 of Generation Jihad. I'm Tom Joscelyn, and I'm joined again this week by Bill Roggio. Bill?
Hello, everyone.
We are, of course, senior fellows at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, and this week we're pleased to be joined by another senior fellow at FDD, Emanuele Ottolenghi. We call him the Great EO. We are very pleased to have him this week. Emanuele is really a specialist on Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which he's done a ton of work on that through the years. And he has just written extensively about what Iran is doing in Latin America and elsewhere. He does a sort of granular, detailed analysis and tracking of Iran, Iranian proxies, and the IRGC that we certainly appreciate. I know I can honestly say this, that, sometimes we have colleagues who, we appreciate their work and we like what they do, but, I may not be such a big fan of it overall in terms of what they do. I could say I'm legitimately a fan of EO's work. I've been following it for years. He's somebody who I'd want to have on this show, regardless of whether or not I technically worked with him or not. So, Emanuele, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for your kind introduction.
We're pleased to have you. So let's do a little bit of your background first. I always like to do this to sort of touch base with, sort of where you're from, how you got into this, that sort of thing. Everybody on the podcast, our listeners know that I'm pretty blunt. So I try and give people some background about, sort of where they're coming from first before we get into the nerdy details. So where are you from?
Well, I'm originally from Italy, a country that has a long history of going behind the authorities' back. So I guess I'm familiar just out of my personal experience with watching, corruption and a good deal of black economy, and growing up, of course, we had the twin terrible phenomena of homegrown terrorism plaguing our political system, and the mafia, of course, which moved up from being a territorially concentrated parallel system of authority involved in all sorts of crime, but mostly racketeering. And then as we move into the late 70s, 80s, it started becoming increasingly involved in traffics that today are global, such as drugs, weapons, human trafficking, you name it, whatever makes money, and then expanded out of their areas to invest globally into anything that could serve for money laundering purposes. So that was a phenomenon that as somebody growing up in Italy was very much present in our mind and in our awareness. But from a professional point of view, I got to the IRGC, to Iran, and eventually also to Hezbollah through different ways. I started working in 2006 for a small think tank in Brussels, the capital of the EU and NATO, and the brief was transatlantic relations. And of course, a huge component of that at the time was negotiations with Iran through the P5+1 mechanism, or as the Europeans like to call it, the EU 3+3. And of course, Europe at the time was the largest trading partner of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and therefore, because of its economic relations, it potentially held the biggest leverage when it came to pressuring the regime into concessions over its nuclear program. And so, starting in late 2006, early 2007, I engaged in research to look at the economic relation between the EU bloc and Iran. And what quickly emerged as fairly open, for all to see, was that Iran was running significant illicit procurement operations all over the European Union. Often, building cross-jurisdictional opaque structures from companies that then linked up to other structures in trading, other trading partners of the EU, such as Turkey, the South Caucasus, and use these shell structures to launder money and also to buy technology that it needed for its nuclear program, but could not obviously obtain legally, that it could only obtain fraudulently. So between 2006 and 2010, I increasingly focused on this dossier, looking both at the legislative and regulatory side of it, what the Europeans could do to build a sanctions architecture, but also to look at how the Iranians were bypassing that growing structure that began tentatively in 2008 with the passing of the first sanctions, following a round of UN Security Council resolutions, and then developed all the way into 2010 European autonomous sanctions coordinated with the US, building on UN Resolution 1929, and then sort of expanded all the way to 2013, 2014, when, of course, with the onset of negotiations over what eventually became the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, began receding, and that experience of several years researching Iranian networks taught me a lot about what the Iranians were doing, building shell companies, spreading their networks in multiple jurisdictions, using offshore jurisdictions, buying passports of convenience for their executives so that they could, avoid stringent scrutiny and so on. And in 2015, as the final touches were being put to the JCPOA, by then I had joined FDD. I joined in 2010 and continued to work on these briefs for several years. In 2015, at FDD, we decided that it was worth looking at what Iran was doing in Latin America as well. Not that Latin America seemed to be the primary focus of nuclear technology procurement. Obviously, there were other markets where the Iranians were going to be a lot more active in that field. But clearly, the Iranians had been trying to get their foot into Latin America for a long time. By 2015, you had, of course, over a decade and a half of Chavismo in Venezuela, with strong and ever-expanding links between the regime in Venezuela and Iran. Some of the U.S. sanctions actually targeted Iranian operations in Venezuela proper. We knew of Iran's nefarious activities up and down the Western Hemisphere. The tragic events of the terror attack against the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires in '92, the AMIA bombing in '94. There was the downing of a plane in Panama in '94 as well, which eventually, as it emerged, was also linked to Iranian terror activity. So we knew that there was a lot going on there. And because at the time also we were interested in expanding our research on Hezbollah, we threw Hezbollah in. And clearly Hezbollah has been extremely active in Latin America as elsewhere. As you know, Hezbollah has been using and abusing Shia expatriate communities for years on a global scale. You have such communities peppered pretty much in every continent, spread around, small communities but cohesive ones, maintaining strong ties with the homeland. You have clan-based structures of large families with members both in Lebanon and across the globe in these communities. And Hezbollah clearly was tapping into these networks to raise funds and eventually, as it became clear, also to money launder proceeds from criminal activities of organized crime with which Hezbollah increasingly cooperates as a way to raise revenue that complements what Iran is giving them directly. So it's a long answer to your question, but I think it captures basically how from a happy and privileged childhood in a troubled country in the Mediterranean, I ended up spending a lot of time watching what happens in Latin America, which is in many ways a place that reminds me of my days living in a Mediterranean country.
Emanuele, thank you for joining us. And, I also joined FDD in 2010, as a decade ago. So we are veterans now. One quick question. You mentioned Hezbollah's role in the drug trade. Can you tell us a little bit how the U.S. discovered Hezbollah's role in the drug trade in South America?
And how extensive is it? Like, basically what are we looking at here for a network in terms of how extensive this is?
Yeah. How much money they're bringing in too? I realize we just hit you with 3 questions there, but we'll get you if you miss one.
They're all interconnected. So let's start with the way they discovered this extensive role that Hezbollah has in the drug trade. As you know, cocaine, the most important drug produced in Latin America, is a multi-billion-dollar global industry today, and 90% of cocaine is or the coca leaf, which is the basis for the drug, grows on the Andean plateau. So it grows basically in Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and to a smaller extent, Venezuela. Colombia historically has been the main producer of cocaine, and a lot of the cocaine production and export from Colombia is intertwined, of course, with the decades-long civil war in that country between the government and the FARC leftist guerrillas, which have ties to Chavez and Chavismo, and increasingly it seems also connections with Hezbollah and the Iranians. They are obviously part of the kind of anti-imperialist leftist front that have beset Latin American politics and bloodied the history of this country. So Colombia was a main ground of what was then the war on drugs, which the successive U.S. administrations fought alongside Latin American allies against the cartels. And so the Colombians were involved in extensive investigations, wiretapping on local cartels. And in the process of conducting wiretapping on cell phones associated with local cartels, the Colombians picked up hundreds of hours of conversations in Arabic. And of course, that was something they did not expect. They did not know what to do with it. They didn't have the capacity to understand what was going on and whether it was relevant. So they asked DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, U.S. law enforcement agency focused on the combat of narcotics, to come in and help. The DEA obliged the request, sent an analyst who sat down and listened to these hundreds of hours of conversation. And what was revealed from those wiretaps was mind-boggling, because clearly there were Lebanese business people talking to the cartels, discussing extensively the movement of bulk shipments, multi-ton bulk shipments of cocaine to Europe, to the United States, and how to launder the proceeds back to Colombia. So the US started investigating these networks, and in the decade that followed, under what eventually became known as Project Cassandra, a sort of a multi-agency led task force led by DEA, looking into money laundering, drug trafficking networks in Latin America. What emerged is that Hezbollah was involved extensively with multiple organized crime syndicates. First of all, laundering the money, but also increasingly actively taking part directly in the trade of cocaine. Now, your question, how much money is that? Now, as you probably know, official figures put out by multiple US government sources, Israeli government sources, indicate that currently Hezbollah's budget is around $1 billion a year, and the assessment is that approximately 700 millions of that come from Iran, which suggests that at the very least $300 million a year come into Hezbollah's coffer from a multiplicity of independent sources, which include fundraising through charities and donations from the communities, but also increasingly organized crime. So the official figures tell us that at least about 30% of that budget is raised through interfacing with criminal organizations. In my humble view, it's a lot more. And the reason I say that is, again, based on the small window that Project Cassandra opened onto this phenomenon, we see that the handful of networks that were investigated, prosecuted, and seemingly disrupted were laundering hundreds of millions of dollars a month. The one that everybody more or less knows about, managed by a Hezbollah facilitator named Ayman Juma, who's a Lebanese with Colombian citizenship, who was operating out of Colombia at the time of the indictments and investigations in 2011, 2012, was at its peak laundering $200 million a month for both Colombian and Mexican cartels. Now, if that is one network, albeit one of the biggest ones, and that network alone was laundering 200 millions a month, we know from the investigations that Hezbollah typically gets anywhere between 7-8% to 15% commission. You know, it's easy to do the math and see that just one network was yielding anywhere between, $400 and $500 million a year of revenue. Now, not all of that goes to Hezbollah, of course. A lot of it stays with the people involved. They need to pay bribes. They need to, they have overhead costs in running the entire operation. But even after you skim that out of the figure, it's still a lot of money that goes back to Hezbollah, and that was one network. Another network targeted and dismantled in Europe in 2016 under something called Operation Cedar, which was done in conjunction with a number of European agencies. That network was yielding about 40 million euro a month for Hezbollah that was going directly to purchase weapons for Hezbollah's involvement in Syria. So when you look at all of this, you see, one, significant revenue that comes not from Iran's largesse, which is not always entirely reliable, especially when Iran is by sanctions. Two, you see a very, very well-oiled, structured global interface between organized crime and terror finance. And three, you see that it permeates the Shia business communities abroad, and it relies on a whole ancillary structure of activities that Hezbollah engages in to ensure that significant chunks of these communities remain loyal. So Hezbollah is not just tapping into the business communities and getting a handful of people to participate. It is also ensuring that the communities as a whole remain loyal and committed. And how does it do that? It puts some of this money into mosques, cultural centers, youth movements, charitable activities. So as time goes by, despite the distance and the generational change, these communities remain committed to the cause.
So whatever happened to Project Cassandra and sort of related efforts, and where does that all stand today?
Also,
and maybe give another brief background on what exactly it was.
Right. So basically involved the pooling together of multiple government agencies to be able to leverage intelligence that was not necessarily always being made available to law enforcement, so that this very complicated interface between crime and terror could be fully understood, investigated, and exposed. And the cooperation between the agencies and the pulling together of resources allowed DEA to conduct multiple successful investigations and indictments, including arrests and extraditions, going after multiple networks and key facilitators of Hezbollah around the globe. Of course, because cocaine is mostly coming out of Latin America, a significant amount of work and time was devoted to going after these networks in Latin America. But we know that because of the family connections, because of the way that the dope moves, these investigations also touched on financial operations in Lebanon, obviously, but also in West Africa. I mean, one of the things that was discovered in the process of investigating Juma and his network was that a significant part of the cocaine money was being used to buy used cars in the United States, ship them over to West Africa, where there is a thriving market for used automobiles. And then the profit, sales and the profit, was being wired back to Lebanon, and through Lebanon cutouts, both banks and money exchanges, was going back eventually to the Colombian cartels minus the commission. So clearly what we learned from that project and those investigations was the extent, the sophistication, the global footprint of this operation that Hezbollah was involved in. Now, something, of course, happened along the way, and that was that the Obama administration, starting in 2012 with secret channel diplomacy through Oman, reached out to the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime was hurting significantly from sanctions, and the Obama administration thought that was, it was enough to get them to the negotiating table. They were right, but we know how the negotiations ended with a less than optimal deal, which actually allowed the Islamic Republic to keep its nuclear infrastructure intact and regain access to financial markets, frozen assets, and basically not reform itself as a way to address the multiple concerns in the region and beyond that Iran poses. And as part of that negotiation, of course, several pressure points that existed up to that moment were relieved. And one of them was, of course, all of these investigations. The Obama administration continued to focus on Hezbollah's sort of more proper terror activities. And, if you go back to those years, you see that they continued to sanction occasionally Hezbollah figures. But these investigations that were more in the field of organized crime, money laundering, so white-collar crime, and drug trafficking, where the connection with Hezbollah was sometimes a little more blurred because the people involved were not necessarily Hezbollah militia members, fighters, party stalwarts. They were sympathizers, supporters. So the Obama administration basically put a stop on these investigations, slowed them down, deprioritized these activities, and eventually these investigations kind of came to a grinding halt after Operation Cedar in January 2016. And I think that even as the Trump administration came in and decided to revisit this whole issue after the Obama administration decision to basically shut down Project Cassandra was exposed in a political lengthy essay in December 2017, it was hard to put back the pieces and to give the DEA, which had been sort of the leading agency in this effort, to put them back into the driving seat, to bring back the people who had left with their institutional memory and knowledge of these complex operations. And so I think that the long-term impact of that fateful decision under the Obama administration to slow down things or bring them to a complete halt has kind of had long-lasting effects, and we see it in the last 4 years, despite the decision by the Trump administration to revive the project, to try to understand what happened, to create a task force to look into Hezbollah's terror finance in Latin America, to designate Hezbollah as a transnational criminal organization in addition to being a terror organization. All of these things have helped, but the pace and impact of investigations has not returned to the pre-JCPOA levels.
Is there any indication that the cartels were aware that they were dealing with and supporting Hezbollah in conducting operations with them, or trafficking drugs with them? I'm just wondering if that was something they were conscious of, or they just thought they were dealing with some random.
I haven't seen any evidence of internal discussions, even sort of clearly a lot of the material that may be relevant to answering your question may not be public.
Right.
But I think that when you look at how cartels have operated traditionally and organized crime globally in general, they are not particularly interested in the politics of those they work with. And again, sort of, one of the largest cartels or organized crime syndicates that works with that is active in the import of cocaine from Latin America into Europe, in the distribution in Southern European markets, is the Calabrese Mafia, the 'Ndrangheta. Now, why would the 'Ndrangheta work with Hezbollah? Seems like a bizarre combination, but the fact of the matter is they work with Balkan criminal organizations to run weapon smuggling networks. They worked with the Albanian mafia for smuggling of cigarettes and marijuana. They don't really care. That has been the modus operandi of organized crime for a long time now. And also, the other thing is this: organized crime tends to be territorially based, right? You have the Italian mafia, you have the PCC in Brazil, you have the Mexican cartels, and of course they oftentimes clash and vie for influence over, adjacent territories. But when they need to go global, they think globally like a corporation. And so it's oftentimes cheaper, much more cost effective to partner up with others who have the infrastructure in distant markets rather than try to send their own and establish a foothold. And so Hezbollah has this advantage for all organized crime globally. They have a presence pretty much everywhere you go. Do you want money laundering networks in Latin America? They are there already. Do you want people to manage transit and logistics in West Africa? They're there. Do you want a distribution network in Europe? They're there. Do you want a presence in North America, in Canada, in the US? They're here. Do you want businessmen to manage the purchase of merchandise for a trade-based money laundering operation in mainland China and Southeast Asia? They're there. Do you want contacts in Australia to launch a distribution in what is probably the most lucrative market for cocaine currently in Oceania? They're there. So you don't need to send your own. They're very ecumenical themselves in who they work with. Hezbollah doesn't care to draft Christians, Druze, Sunnis, even Jews to these operations. And so they all gain from it.
So black cocaine, what can you tell us about that? You recently wrote a piece on that. It's fascinating.
Yes, it is a fascinating story, and it made me drastically revise my approach to barbecuing in the process.
Exactly.
So, as you know, cocaine being illicit requires the cartels to invent and the organized crime syndicates to always invent ingenious ways to disguise the merchandise they ship. And in my 5 years in Latin America, I've seen contraband and illicit products such as cocaine, marijuana, illicit cigarettes, you name it, hidden in anything you can imagine, from digging the hollowing the trunk of trees, to hiding it in under fruits such as bananas, to making fake pineapples, to making fake avocados, dolls, toys, you name it, whatever can be used. Now, in the past decade, the cartels have figured out a way to process cocaine to make it look like charcoal briquettes. Now, why charcoal? Because Latin America, sadly, is one of the largest exporters of charcoal around the world. It is contributing to the very fast deforestation of the two largest green lungs in Latin America, the Amazon forest and the Chaco in the Paraguay, Bolivia, Argentina area. Now, charcoal, we use it to grill our barbecues on 4th of July. We use it to it's used extensively in restaurants around the world for grilling, for cooking. It is also used for fuel in some developing countries, especially in Africa. So there is an enormous amount of movement of this merchandise, and they use it to disguise cocaine. And what's interesting is that it is increasingly becoming one of the disguises of choice. There was just 3 months ago a seizure of over 3 tons of cocaine hidden in containers of charcoal in Paraguay that was being shipped over to Europe. So clearly they're onto something. And one of the problems, I'm told, with this disguise is that sniffer dogs don't always catch it. The smell of charcoal is overwhelming them, and so it is a good disguise. And again, it as when you look at it, whether it is from the crime perspective or the environment perspective, the ripple effect of these activities is dramatic, and it goes in all sorts of directions.
Not to make light of it, but boy, you can really run the risk of freebasing while you're barbecuing, I guess. So, yeah. But the tri-border
Yes.
area, tell us about that. It's why is it a key area for Hezbollah for its finances, etc.?
Right. So as much as Colombia is key for the export or the production and export of cocaine, the tri-border is essential for money laundering purposes. It is an area that was traditionally fairly lawless. It is, the conjunction or the meeting point of 3 countries at a T-junction of 2 major rivers in Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. Fairly remote area in the periphery of all 3 countries. So traditionally was an area of smuggling well before it became developed. But it enjoyed a significant development push through basically 2 significant infrastructure projects in the 60s through the 80s, namely the building of bridges that connected the 3 countries over the 2 rivers. So one bridge between Brazil and Paraguay, one between Brazil and Argentina. But also, more importantly, the building of the what is called the Taipo Dam on the Paraná River, just north of the tri-border, about a mile north. The Taipo Dam is the 2nd largest hydroelectric project in the world, second only to the Three Gorges Dam in China. It is the first in the world in electricity production. It accounts for all of the electricity consumption of Paraguay, and the Paraguayans are actually selling back a lot of that energy to Brazil. It created a vast artificial lake that separates Brazil and Paraguay with about 1,000 miles of coastline in a very rugged rural area. and so it's smuggling paradise, and it is an area that, thanks to these two large projects, has developed economically in very significant ways. It is also a tourist attraction because just east of the dam, on the Iguazu River, the smaller of the two, you have one of the greatest wonders of nature, the Iguazu Falls, which are, again, the second largest waterfalls in the world after the Victoria Falls in Africa. They're bigger than Niagara Falls, just to put them into the right context. So that draws an enormous amount of tourists coming in from all parts of the world. It generates revenue. It has created a service industry. And so the bureaucracy that runs the dam and the technicians, the military presence, because it's a border area, the falls with tourism, they all have conjured up a significant economy. It today is a metropolitan area of about 1 million people, with more than 5 million people a year transiting through the airports for tourist purposes, for tourism purposes. And since 1984, the Paraguayans created a free trade zone on their side. So when you cross into Paraguay, you can buy any brand you can think of, both authentic and fake, for a fraction of its market price elsewhere in the world. And because you have contraband and loose controls at the border, people can go in, buy for cheap, bring it back to their countries and sell it. So that has created an ideal place for money laundering. Now, why is it important for Hezbollah? Because when during the 1970s, 1980s, as the then dictator of Paraguay, the late Alfredo Stroessner, who was basically a clerical fascist Latin American caudillo with a preference for children underage as a pastime, wanted to develop the economy. He invited immigration into the country. He invited Mennonites to go into the rural areas of Paraguay and build large farms. And he invited the Lebanese to come in. Now, in the 1970s, 1980, Lebanon, of course, was experiencing civil war, and which then sort of snowballed into the war between the PLO and Israel in 1982. And so that created a strong incentive for a lot of Lebanese, including Shia, to move to the tri-border and basically blend into that exploding economy. And that's what they did. They came, they contributed enormously to the development of the free trade zone on the Paraguayan side. They became established. They created their own institutions, mosques, schools, youth movements. They maintained a connection to the country. And of course, as Hezbollah became a key player in Lebanon, they saw that community and the economic potential of the area and decided to leverage it. And so today, all of the institutions linked to the Shia community in the area are tied either to Hezbollah or to the Amal party, the other Shia political party that has become increasingly almost a satellite of Hezbollah. And because of the characteristics I described of the economic characteristics, that has become a critical nodal point in the money laundering operation. Now, increasingly also, Paraguay is becoming a transit point for cocaine, not just because Bolivia and Peru, as producers of cocaine that will move east all the way to the Atlantic ports in Brazil and then on to Europe, view Paraguay as a transit point, but also because increasingly the Colombian cartels view Paraguay as a service industry for their activities. So a lot of cocaine that would traditionally go out of Colombia straight onto shipments in the Atlantic, or would go to Venezuela as a transit point, is moving south to Paraguay first. Why is that? Well, because Brazil is increasingly a consumer, but also because increasingly is a transit point. And so Paraguay has become important, not just because of the money laundering, but now for that traffic too. And Hezbollah is at the center of all of this.
And the Lebanese government, how have they covered for Hezbollah's activities in the tri-border region? There was an arrest, and tell us about that.
Right. So the these communities have over the years cultivated local authorities. They have developed friendly relations. They have bought influence. They have paid off politicians, judges, policemen, you name it, in order to maintain a well-functioning machine. In communities like the Tri-Border, some of them even are rising up as local stars in local politics, so they run for office. But all of that is not always enough to guarantee that the machine keeps moving. And so when their members get into trouble with the law, and this enormous influence they've built over the decades is not enough, that's when the Lebanese or the Iranian governments step in. We've seen it in many other places. Last summer, we've seen the arrest of Alex Saab, a Venezuelan Colombian businessman of Lebanese origin that is very much involved, according to a U.S. indictment, in helping the Maduro regime run its illicit financial operation with Iran. He was arrested in Cape Verde on his way while he was basically refueling on the ground. And there's been an enormous political pressure from Iran on Cape Verde authorities not to extradite him. We've seen when Qasem Tajuddin, the Lebanese businessman who was running money laundering operations for Hezbollah in West Africa, he was arrested by the Moroccans in Rabat while on transit. Again, diplomatic pressure was brought to bear on the Moroccans to try and prevent his extradition to the States. So this is a model that we see pretty much everywhere, and in the Tri-Border area as well. So when local authorities, at the behest of American investigators, arrested a key money launderer in the Tri-Border in May 2018, immediately you saw that the Lebanese embassy in Asuncion sprung into action. Now, an interesting detail, an aside, but I think it reveals a lot. The ambassador is a member of a southern Lebanon Shia clan, and from a village specifically in the south, where this family is very strong. And the family has an enormous amount of members in Paraguay. So he is actually a cousin of some of the businessmen that were using this suspect for their money laundering activities. So how much of it was, urged by Gibran Bassil in the foreign ministry in Lebanon? How much of it was spurred by family ties? How much of it was done at the urging of Hezbollah? It's difficult to tell which is which. But what you can see is that it was a coordinated effort where the ambassador publicly threatened the government prosecution, urging them not to extradite this person, where money offers were made to specific prosecutors, where the lawyer for the suspect was likely paid from outside sources, and where Hezbollah media in Arabic was repeating the same argument in defense of the suspect that you were reading on the Twitter feed of his lawyer in Paraguay. So clearly there was a coordinated effort, because the exposure of this network, the arrest of this individual, and the subsequent investigation potentially would expose significant criminal activities. And although the trial hasn't started yet, the court documents that are coming out already showing that U.S. authorities consider this man at the center of one of, and I'm quoting from court documents, the largest drug trafficking, money laundering networks in Latin America. So this is not a small operation, and that's why Hezbollah goes through embassies and diplomats and other means in order to thwart these investigations.
Tom, do you have any further questions for Emanuele? I just have one left, but I'll save it for last.
I was just wondering, what do you think I know it's impossible. I know the answer to this question is probably impossible to give me a precise answer, and so I'm going to do to you what people always do to me. They ask me questions where the answer is not really fully knowable. But of all the drugs that come into the U.S., what percentage would you say, or what's the size of? Let's forget about percentage. What's the size you think of Hezbollah's involvement in drugs that are flowing into the U.S. so Americans can understand sort of what their role is in this in terms of the drug traffic coming into that's affecting American communities.
I don't have an exact figure, and it's hard to tell, but I want to sort of make here 2 points here. First of all, in 2017, so at the beginning of the Trump administration, when the administration came out very strongly prioritizing the fight against opioids, and by the way, a lot of the opioids that wash up in the homes of Americans and feed into our terrible addiction problem are not legal drugs overprescribed. They're increasingly being produced by Mexican cartels and smuggled through across the borders.
Yeah, there's a whole Chinese angle to that as well.
There is a whole Chinese angle, and of course, when these drugs are being produced without any regulatory supervision, they're mixed up with cocaine, they're mixed up with other dangerous substances, which contribute to overdoses and deaths. But when that happened in 2017, actually the deaths from cocaine overdose in America were as high, if not higher, than opioids. And so there is an addiction problem that is very significant. Still, it is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And also, when you think about the fact that revenues or percentages of revenues from the sales and proceeds of cocaine go to finance weapons procurement for Hezbollah in Syria and elsewhere in the region, then sort of
you're anticipating my follow-on question, but go
right,
ahead.
You can quantify how much each of our consumers are contributing to mayhem and death in the region, right? Because in Lebanon, you can buy an AK-47 for, I think, a few $100s. Now, a gram of cocaine on a street market price, I think, is still around $80 to $100 in the US today. So, a Saturday night party in an upscale apartment in some well-to-do neighborhood of Miami, New York, or elsewhere, where cocaine is being used for recreational purposes by the upper middle class and upper class, that buys a weapon for a militia fighter, that party alone. So we are feeding into the violence and mayhem in the region, not to mention the fact that for every shipment of cocaine that reaches our markets, there is a trail of blood, death, violence, and destruction of civil society throughout Central America as the drug makes its ways from the Andean plateau to the Mexican border. And that is what I think Americans need to come to terms with. With our consumption, we are feeding into the erosion of civil society, the corruption that feeds into the traffic, the violent deaths of thousands of people, the destruction of institutions, the corruption of law enforcement and intelligence agencies across Central America, the drafting of an entire generation of youth to the drug trafficking business as opposed to constructive, lawful business activities, and so on and so forth. The ripple effects of this are immense, and some of it goes straight into the coffers of Hezbollah to continue to radicalize Lebanese youth in Lebanon and abroad, to continue to feed into conflict in the region, to fund terror plots globally, and so on.
We're here with our colleague, another FDD senior fellow, Emanuele Ottolenghi, who he has a wealth of knowledge, if you've been listening, obviously, about Hezbollah and Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. I don't know if you'll take this as a compliment, Emanuele, but I consider you a fellow nerd. Just listening to you again, you really know this stuff like the back of your hand. You know all sorts of details, which is great. We have a few follow-up questions for you on this stuff, just to sort of tie a bow on some of these topics. Not that any of them are very cheery. So, one of the arguments I've heard or seen made quite a few times is that, basically Hezbollah won't commit a terrorist attack inside the U.S. or is hesitant to do so. And obviously they haven't had a hand in a direct attack, inside the U.S. Sort of, we always think about Al-Qaeda and 9/11, and there's a whole Hezbollah-Iran story there in terms of shuttling the hijackers. But, in terms of committing an attack inside the U.S., one of the arguments we see is that Hezbollah doesn't want to jeopardize these sort of very lucrative, profitable revenue streams that they're getting from the drug trade, from drug trafficking, and from these illicit procurement networks, that if they did do something big as sort of some retaliation against the U.S. or some sort of provocative act, it would sort of bring all that into jeopardy. What do you think about all that? Do you think, could you see and imagine a world in which, these networks which are delivering cocaine into the U.S. could also play a role in, sort of a direct terrorist attack? Or do you think that do you buy the argument that they're so worried about losing the revenues and profits from this that they would be hesitant to do so?
So, first of all, let me take you back to 2011 when we learned that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force was plotting to blow up the then Saudi ambassador to Washington at a very upscale, well-known, popular Italian restaurant in Georgetown here in Washington, D.C. Now, had that plot panned out, not only would the Iranians have killed a Saudi diplomat in Washington, but they would have killed probably dozens of customers at the restaurant and in the vicinities in the process.
And they were using a cutout for that, right? In terms of the cartels.
Correct. So So what's interesting about that story, and perhaps is something that has not been highlighted enough in the press coverage and subsequent, writings about the story, is that the Iranian American who was involved in that plot in sort of putting together the pieces to organize the terror attack was a used car salesman based in Texas, who, when tasked with procuring explosives for the attack, went to the Zeta cartels. Now, why did he go to the Zeta cartels in Mexico? Of all people who could have helped him supply the merchandise needed for the plot? Because the Zeta cartels had extensive contacts with Hezbollah. So Hezbollah very likely facilitated that connection. And, luck had it that he ended up speaking with an informant of U.S. authorities, who then conveyed the details of the plot, and that's how it was thwarted. But clearly, there was no compunction there about, causing, tremendous loss of life and damage in the heart of our nation's capital by Hezbollah and Iran. Now, that's one thing. The second thing is that, of course, more recently, U.S. authorities arrested twice in 2017 and once in 2019, external security organization agents, Hezbollah ESO agents, in the United States.
Yeah, we wrote about them at Long War Journal at the time. Their plotting was revelatory in many ways. I mean, just to give some background, one of the guys was basically living not far south from where I live, not to give too much away. So it was, and it's a neighborhood I know actually through family connections and otherwise. So it was a very interesting story to see that.
Correct. And when you read again the sort of the indictments, the criminal complaints, the affidavits by the agents involved in the investigation, you learn a lot of interesting things. One is that by design, not by chance, Hezbollah relied on Lebanese immigrants and waited to activate them until they obtain U.S. citizenship. So clearly they wanted these agents to operate under the cover of a US passport. One. Two, they tasked these agents with surveillance of multiple targets, including some in the United States, federal buildings in Manhattan, JFK,
Yep.
Also in Canada, the Toronto International Airport. And three, in one of the three cases, one of the potential targets was actually in Central America. It was in Panama.
Mm-hmm.
The agent was tasked to identify and scout both the Israeli and the US Embassy in Panama City, and also to scout the canal.
The canal, yeah.
And identify vulnerabilities of the canal. So imagine, had that plot panned out, the huge impact, not just the loss of life, but the devastating impact on global commerce by blowing up the canal and making it unusable for whatever time that would have been. The repercussions would have been immense. And it's clear because that case is kind of dormant in the docket 3 years later, almost 4 years later. So presumably the case is still ongoing. The investigation is still ongoing.
By the way, my sense from going through that case, the paperwork from that case, was that there was a significant amount of compartmentalization in the planning and the plotting. That basically the guys who were identified were mainly for surveillance and trying to lay the groundwork for something possible in the future. They were operating through the Islamic Jihad organization wing of Hezbollah, which of course is a name that caused some confusion in the 80s when the Islamic Jihad was used as a name claiming responsibility for attacks in Lebanon. You can still see it in some of the reporting to this day where people are confused about what actually transpired in Lebanon, when people just can't come to terms with the fact that it was Hezbollah and just is another name for that part of Hezbollah's operations,
Absolutely. But when you sort of take that case and you look at the time frame of that case, it fits into a more global pattern where Hezbollah was trying to plot attacks elsewhere. We know from from investigations as well as news coverage that MI5 in London raided a warehouse in October 2015 where they found large quantities of ammonium nitrate linked to Hezbollah. We know about the Cyprus case where 8 tons of ammonium nitrate were stored in a warehouse by a Hezbollah agent who was arrested. The guy who went to Panama had that experience of handling ammonium nitrate. And again, sort of how do you procure those quantities of ammonium nitrate? You do so through legitimate looking commercial businesses, import-export. Panama is an ideal place for that with the Cologne Free Trade Zone. We know that Panama had a role in Hezbollah's money laundering operations from a variety of cases and sources. So clearly, while these plots didn't pan out and there hasn't been a terror attack, it's not for want of trying. They saw it fit to tap into these money laundering networks and the communities on the ground in order to provide the logistical supports for these agents as they were moving in and out of Central America to organize this major attack. And it's a blessing that it didn't happen. But clearly, if the order comes from Tehran to carry out such an attack, they will not hesitate to potentially expose and put in jeopardy some of these networks in order to fulfill the order.
I've got one more question. As a New Yorker, I got this question for you. So years ago, somebody who was in the security world, okay, was walking me down 6th Avenue and said to me, "You see that stand over there?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "That's a contraband stand that's run by Hezbollah. That basically they're selling T-shirts and that sort of thing, and the money, we know, we've been watching them, their money actually goes to Hezbollah." Have you come across, we've been talking a lot about cocaine and the drug trafficking and that sort of thing. How about the other sort of businesses that Hezbollah deals in, other sources of contraband or illegal products that potentially are coming into the U.S.? I have done no deep dive on this. I just have this one anecdote from my stroll through New York City, Midtown, years ago. By the way, I don't think that stand is still there, and of course I didn't buy anything from it. But if you come across any sort of other examples like that.
Absolutely. I mean, a key component of this massive global operation is, of course, trade-based money laundering. Sort of the movement of value linked to illicit proceeds from such activities as drug trafficking, the movement of value through merchandise. So,
By the way, some of the Hezbollah shirts were kind of nice, actually. By the way, too, just so you know, they were cheap knockoffs. As a New Yorker, there are good knockoffs and there are bad knockoffs. And I gotta say, the Hezbollah guys, they had some pretty good knockoffs. So,
well, I actually have a funny anecdote to tell. On my very first trip to Latin America, I spent a day hopelessly looking for a store in a heavily Lebanese area of São Paulo in Brazil for a Hezbollah T-shirt, because one of my contacts there told me that you could buy it in local shops. So after failing to procure it, I went back to my contact. I said, I couldn't find it. So he made a commitment to me that if he could find it, he would buy it for me. So eventually, 2-3 years later, he came back to me and said, I was visiting Bahia, which is in the north, as far away as you can imagine from the hubs of known Hezbollah activity. And sure enough, he walked into a Lebanese pastry shop run by a Lebanese Christian and bought me for 30 reais, which is about $6 at current exchange rate, a bright yellow T-shirt with the Hezbollah logo on it. And when he asked the lady why she was selling this stuff, she said, Hezbollah defends the Christians in Syria. That's why I like them. So that stuff is out there. But more seriously, more importantly, because you want to, when you move these merchandise, I see, you see T-shirts, mobile phones, PlayStation consoles, cosmetics, you name it. For the drug trade, that is a brick of cocaine dollar equivalent, right? The fridge that shows up and is sold at a retail shop in a free trade zone is the value of the cocaine brick sold in Europe, in the Middle East, as far as Australia. And so a huge component of the Hezbollah criminal operation is to run thousands of these small companies and shops across the world that trade in what look to us as benign, perfectly legitimate products, but they are really a disguise for moving money tied to criminal proceeds. So up and down the Florida Peninsula, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of companies that trade in electronics, mostly electronics, but also other products. I have found ties to Hezbollah money laundering operations as far as Texas, Nevada, California. Obviously, in Michigan, there is a lot of activity there. And usually it is electronics, but it can be clothes, it can be cosmetics. I have found a thriving trade of cosmetic products such as shampoo, conditioner, lip balm. Lately, I'm seeing a lot of...
It's sort of like the list of Joker products from the original Batman there,
Absolutely. But I mean, the latest thing I've seen, just to go back to black cocaine...
Don't combine lipstick with the shampoo or something, so...
Well, I mean, there's a whole backstory as to why they're moving cosmetics, apparently, and I'm not going to go into the weeds too much.
No, we're gonna have you back on the show because you just know so much about these topics, and just as I'm listening to you talk, I've got about 20 extra questions for you. Yeah. But when you come back on the show, you're gonna have to wear the Hezbollah T-shirt when you come on. That's all I'm gonna say. And
I'll wave it.
And the other thing is, I got to say this, Bill. I'll let you have the one last question for him, Bill, as we close this up. But Hezbollah's got their merchandise going. We still haven't gotten ours out yet. So that's sort of the long word journal. I mean, that's how pathetic we are at getting our stuff, out there. We can't even market ourselves at all. Hezbollah's selling T-shirts in Latin America, and we can't even,
sell T-shirts here in America.
I know.
Are the epitome of fail.
That's how we should see them. They're a global criminal brand.
Yeah, we're definitely not a global brand, but we should be able to sell a couple T-shirts, So.
I'll buy one when you're having them ready.
Oh, you'll get one for free. No worries.
Don't worry.
Okay.
I actually have two questions, but one of them is not very serious. Al Mustafa International University was recently designated by the U.S. Treasury Department for its ties to the IRGC. How does the IRGC use Al Mustafa as part of its international operations, and how extensive, how many branches does, or in how many countries does Al Mustafa have worldwide?
So again, it's difficult to pin down an exact number, but it's they're active in dozens of countries globally, and they have hundreds of affiliates and entities linked to them. They obviously disguise the connection oftentimes, but I've seen them in Latin America. They're present in almost every country, if not all countries in Latin America. They're very active in Africa. They have a presence in Europe. They're active in India. They're active. They have a huge campus in Kabul, in Afghanistan. They're active in Southeast Asia. And what's interesting about Al Mustafa is that it is not just a school that trains foreign-born Shias. So they tap into the Shia diaspora all over the world and bring them in to study in Qom, but they very deliberately send out missionaries on a global scale to convert people to Shia Islam and to bring them into the fold, to train them in Iran, and then to send them back to their native countries to run the operations locally. So in Latin America, I have a map of their activities in Brazil, where they're very active, in São Paulo, in Rio, in Bahia, but also in smaller towns like Guarapuava, Ponta Grossa, in the tri-border area itself. They have a presence in Chile, where there's almost no Shia Islam to speak of. Have a presence in Argentina, obviously, which is where it all started. Rabbani, the man behind the AMIA bombing, started out as a missionary cleric to Argentina in the early 1980s. They have a center in Quito, in Ecuador. They have a presence in Bolivia, in Colombia, and interestingly enough, even in Cuba, they have been allowed to open up shop. So it's a very, very widespread operation that includes not just mosques and cultural centers. They have publications in multiple languages. They have classes online. They have website platforms for media, for information, for education. They have radio stations that they run in multiple places. And again, by tapping into local converts who know the culture and the language best, they're able to amplify the message. Now, how do they interface with the IRGC and the, broadly speaking, the Iranian regime apparatus? So we know from a handful of cases that the embassies actually act as conduits for recruitment of these operations. There was a case in Mexico almost 10 years ago where a Mexican university student decided actually to infiltrate this operation and sort of managed to get himself into a group of Mexicans who were being sent over to Iran for classes, and afterwards he exposed the whole operation. And clearly the Iranian embassy in Mexico City was played a critical role in the recruitment operation, in organizing the trip and sending the funds over to pay for the expenses. So that's one element where you see this interface. The second, of course, is that in some cases you've seen these networks, or the clerics in the networks, or the centers in the networks contribute in whichever way to the organization of terrorist plots. I mean, the latest one was, of course, the failed terrorist attack against the Mujahideen Khalq rally in July 2018 in Paris. Now, we know, and that's been fairly well advertised, that Iranian diplomats were involved, implicated in that plot. But in October 2018, French authorities also raided an Islamic center linked to Iran in the north of France as part of that plot. So clearly, they have that role too. They act as a sounding board for the Iranian revolutionary message. They spread that message through their activity, through their missionary activity, through their charitable activity, through their educational activities. They send it out both to Shia communities and to potential converts. But they're also there, like everything else we've discussed on this program, as a tool that can provide logistical infrastructure support when the regime decides to go out and engage in more nefarious activities than just spreading its revolutionary message.
Billy, yeah, one more quick,
lighthearted
question.
Yeah, this is lighthearted. So I'm a big fan of the Narcos series on Netflix, Emanuele. You familiar with that?
I have to confess, I am very squeamish about graphic violence on TV. I don't go much beyond Walt Disney when it comes to TV, but I'm familiar with the series. Yeah,
very, very fantastic. You think there's any chance we'll get a Narcos Hezbollah in the future? And if so, would you be willing to take a short role in that? I think you're one of the best dressers I know, and I think
you're very kind.
You'd be making a good choice.
I gotta say, you really do dress very sharply. It's you're a very sharp dresser. Actually, now you say that, yeah, you got nice cufflinks and cuff shirts and everything. Kind of envious, actually. It's a good point.
I can think in the broad pantheon of Hollywood stars. I can think of better versions of me who could play that part. I obviously would be honored. There's been a Netflix production about the Tri-Border, which was a bit of a flop with Ben Affleck. And of course, if Ben Affleck,
well, of course, that could be Ben Affleck.
I would be very delighted. But more seriously, there is a growing interest in the documentary industry in looking at these stories, and there are a number of productions that I have been consulting with to help them put together a package, and hopefully that'll bring more attention to the story. But I wouldn't rule it out that eventually we will see also some fictional account. If you think about it, it's a great story, a story that lends itself to drama, to action, to all sorts of interesting and entertaining angles. And if anything, I would add that the fact that Netflix productions such as Ozark have garnered such success, and I'm a huge fan, actually, if any one of you wants to watch it, of a Brazilian production called The Mechanism, which is about it's a dramatization of the largest corruption and money laundering scandal that rocked Brazilian politics, Lava Jato. Mm-hmm. So if these series do actually make a splash and get a lot of following and success, I think that a narco-terrorism series about Hezbollah and the cartels in Latin America would be a huge hit, and it would help make the broader public understand actually how dangerous this convergence is.
Well, thank you again. We've been joined this week by our colleague Emanuele Ottolenghi. We're going to pester him to be on the show again because there's a lot to talk about still. We are going to release this episode, I think, probably the week of Christmas. So happy Hanukkah and Merry Christmas to everybody. We're going to be launching a Patreon page soon to get contributions. You can't buy any Hezbollah t-shirts, unfortunately, but hopefully eventually we'll be able to send some Long War Journal t-shirts and some other stuff your way. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Emanuele, for joining the show.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And happy holidays.
And thank you to our listeners for listening to this week's episode of Generation Jihad. Please do subscribe to the show. As a reminder, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. By the way, I still don't use Apple Podcasts or Spotify, Bill. I do watch stuff on YouTube. Or anywhere else you listen to your podcasts. And we will see you again next week.